All right, so Rachel's in effect predicts that faced with the parallel argument, you might have the following reaction. You might say, but look, the shape of the Earth, that's something we can prove, right? By contrast, the morality of infanticide, that's not something we can prove. So the parallel argument doesn't really show that the cultural differences argument is invalid. And here's how he responds to that reaction. Right? He says, look, this line of thought does not save the cultural differences argument. Because the cultural differences argument is an argument for moral skepticism premised simply on the existence of disagreement. And if that's the nature of the premises, then the parallel argument really does show that the cultural differences argument is invalid. So to say this is not to save the cultural differences argument. But he says, that doesn't mean there's nothing to this line of thought. It just needs to be reconfigured, right? I mean, it's not a line of thought that gives you a way of saving the cultural differences argument. It's instead a line of thought that suggests a second, different, independent argument in favor of moral skepticism. And he says that argument is well worth considering. He gives it a name, the provability argument, and he sets it out for you. Right? So here it is. All right. Same two questions then we want to ask about this argument as we asked about the cultural differences argument, as we standardly ask about any argument once we've got it formulated, which are, is it valid, and are the premises true? Quite right, yes. So start with the first question. Is this a valid argument? Is the provability argument valid? Let's see. So how many people are confident in answering that question? Raise your hand if you're confident that you know the answer to the question. Is the provability argument valid? All right. So it looks like I've got these kind of tentative hands here, but I would say so not many people. Okay, so the answer to the question, is the provability argument valid, is yes. Okay. To see that that's the answer, it can be helpful to employ a little technique, a technique that involves taking little baby steps in the direction of logic, a technique of abbreviation, right? So what we do if we use this technique is we use short, boring names for the component statements of which the argument's made up in order to abbreviate the argument and make its structure clearer. So if we go back to the PowerPoint for a sec, use this abbreviation scheme. Call the claim that there is such a thing as objective truth in ethics O, and the claim that we can prove that some moral opinions are true and others false, P. So there is such a thing as objective truth in ethics, call that statement O, call the claim that we can prove that some moral opinions are true and others false, P. Using that abbreviation scheme, what does premise 1 say? Again, here's how the abbreviation scheme works. Call the claim that there's such a thing as objective truth in ethics O. Call the claim that we can prove that some moral opinions are true and others false, P. Using that scheme of abbreviation, what does premise 1 of this argument say? False. Sorry?
First one is false.
No, it doesn't. I mean, that's the right sort of thing, because that, that would be another way to put what you said, that the first one is false, would be to say not O. But premise 1 does not say not O. It says something different.
So the question you're asking is, what is he trying to say?
So you say the question I'm asking is, what is he trying to say? Well, no, not really. I mean, I'm asking you to abbreviate this argument using the scheme I gave you. Okay. I should say, I don't want to pick on you for using this very common locution, what he's trying to say, right? But, I mean, look, if you're reading philosophers, right, your working assumption should be that what they're trying to say is what they say, right? That they're pretty good at saying stuff, and if, not true of absolutely everyone, and I might use that locution, say, of Kant, who I think is sort of a poor writer, but in general, right, assume that what philosophers are trying to say is what they succeed in saying, right? Because that locution leads you in the direction of thinking that this philosopher is trying to express some familiar line of thought that you encountered in the bar last night, and they probably aren't, right? You know what I'm saying? All right. So back to our problem, maybe back to the slide temporarily. So we're in the business of trying to use the abbreviation scheme to tell us what premise 1 says. It is. It is if O, then P. Yes. That's what premise 1 says using that abbreviation scheme. Okay. So now we got going on this. Go back. So what does premise 2 say? Same abbreviation scheme. Call the statement that there is such a thing as objective truth in ethics O. The statement that we can prove that some moral opinions are true and others false, P. What does premise 2 say? Yes?
P is false?
Yeah, or not P. That's right. What does 3 say? I've got it on a slide in a sec.
Therefore, there's no O.
Yeah, therefore not O. Right, so to do it on the slide here, look, this is the structure of the provability argument. once you see that the argument has this structure, you're in a position to see that it's valid, right? Because all arguments with this structure are valid arguments, right? To see that, I mean, look back at the slide temporarily. Look, I mean, so the way this argument works, which premise 1 tells you if there's O, there has to be P. Premise 2 tells you there's not P, right? Put those together and you're guaranteed that there's not O. Yeah? You see that? So that's to see that this is the structure of a valid argument, right? And then what we've already done is to show that that is the structure of the provability argument, right? So the provability argument is valid, right? Everyone okay with that? Good. Okay, so the answer then to, we switch back to the other view. Thanks. The answer to the first question about the provability argument, namely, is it valid, is yes, right? Okay, next. Does Rachels think the provability argument is sound? Yes. Does he think it's sound?
What I got from that was that they said they think it sounds true, but I wasn't sure if it was a sound argument. I was a little confused on that.
Okay, so you're not clear about what he says about that. Okay, good. Well, I mean, that's why we're here. Okay, so I'll tell you the answer to that one. Rachels does not think the argument is sound. Okay, so if he thinks the argument is valid but not sound, what must he think? Yes?
That one of the premises are false.
That at least one of the premises is false. Good. So go back to the original slide. So Rachels has got to think one of the premises is false. He's got to give you reasons to reject one of the premises. Which premise does he give you reasons to reject? Which premise does he criticize?
Number 1.
No, it's number 2. You ask, is it number 1? No, it's number 2. We'll come back to number 1, but he really doesn't focus critical attention on number 1. We could switch views here. Instead, what he does is he focuses attention on number 2. He gives you, this is, where is it? Page 26. Well, 25 to 26, starting at the very bottom of 25 and then occupying most of 26. He gives you a number of examples designed to demonstrate that some moral opinions can be proved, right? There are I guess 4 of them in total. But the one he does at most length is an example that goes something like this, right? Consider questions of the fairness of a grading scheme in a class, right? That's a moral matter, right? Fairness is issues of fairness are moral questions. So, in effect, Rachel says, suppose it's like this, right? Suppose this is not an introductory philosophy class, but an introductory physics class. Right? Suppose at the beginning of the semester, I distribute a syllabus, and the syllabus says they're going to be, 2 exams along the way and a final. The 2 exams along the way will be worth 25% each. The final will be worth 50%. The final is comprehensive in that it covers, basically what we've done for the semester. Right? Then suppose a week before the end of the semester, or if it's a summer school class, 2 days before the end of the semester, I tell you, I've changed my mind. Instead of the final being worth 50%, the final is going to be worth 90%. Furthermore, the final is not going to be comprehensive, in terms of referring back explicitly to the stuff we covered over the course of the semester. Instead, the final is going to be what I call a test of your grasp of basic physical principles. And it turns out that the kind of grasp of basic physical principles I have in mind is the kind of grasp that you might expect a pretty good graduate student in physics to have. You all take this final, you all bomb it, I give you all Fs in the class. Right? Rachel says, what I've provided you with there is all the evidence you need to prove that the grading scheme is unfair. So here's a matter, a moral matter, the matter of whether or not a certain grading scheme is fair, which is such that we can prove it. So the general claim we can never prove whether any moral principles are true or false is wrong. See how that works? Yeah. So then Rachel's line on the provability argument is, the argument's valid, but it's unsound because premise 2 is false. If we go back to the PowerPoint for a sec, Rachel's doesn't himself question premise 1. But you could. Right? Here's a way to do it. We could switch back to the other view. You could say, look, the idea that if there were any such thing as objective truth in ethics, we should be able to prove that some moral opinions are true and others false. That's kind of a species of the idea, the more general idea that if there's a truth about something, we've got to be able to prove it. But you might say that general idea reflects or involves a kind of unwarranted arrogance about our ability to prove things. It's perfectly possible that there be matters about which there's an objective truth, but about which we're in no position to give any proof. Right? I mean, here's one sort of example, right? Consider what's happening right now in very, very distant parts of the universe. Right? I mean, you've got to be a bit careful if you're doing the relativity stuff about what right now means, but there's a way of understanding it that will work for our purposes. Right? I mean, there is something that's happening right now in those very distant parts of the universe, right? But we've got no way to prove it. Right? I mean, the light from there isn't going to be here for thousands of years. Right? So there's a matter about which there's an objective truth, but we're in no position to prove it. So you might say the general idea that if there's an objective truth about something, we got to be able to prove it is wrong. Right? So premise 1 of the provability argument is wrong. All right. So if you follow Rachel so far, right, the idea is sort of the moral skeptics 0 for 2, right? We got 2 arguments offered in favor of moral skepticism, and neither of them's worked, right? First argument, cultural differences argument, turns out to be invalid, right? Provability argument, he thinks, I mean, yeah, it's valid, but it's not sound. One of the key premises he thinks he can give you examples to show is false. He has, I think, there properly identified 2 familiar, important lines of argument for moral skepticism. Right? I think, though, that there's a third familiar kind of argument that he hasn't in the same way identified. So what I want to do now is to make some distinctions that he does not so explicitly make, which will among other things, allow us to develop that third kind of argument. So, let me get the PowerPoint here just to make sure I've got the one I want. Okay, so we can then distinguish, we go to PowerPoint, three different ideas in this broadly moral relativist ballpark. First, there's the thing we've been focusing on so far, moral skepticism, as we've seen, the claim that there's no such thing as objective moral truth. Distinguish this from a second view we can call cultural relativism. This is the view that the moral code of a society determines what is right in that society. Let me say a couple of things about cultural relativism. First, to sort of introduce it, we can use sort of the same example that we used when we were giving the cultural differences argument, right? So, I mean, one way to sort of get the idea about what cultural relativism is to say, well, look, cultural relativism says, you know, if the Eskimo moral code permits infanticide, then it follows that infanticide really is permissible in Eskimo society, right? The moral code of any given society determines what's right and wrong in that society. Yeah? But caution here, look, the cultural differences argument is one thing, cultural relativism is another, right? The cultural differences argument, as we looked at it, that's one argument in favor of moral skepticism. Cultural relativism, by contrast, is an alternative view. It's an alternative theory, view, conclusion from moral skepticism. So it's not an argument, and it's certainly not the same thing as the cultural differences argument, even though we can sort of appeal in a different way to the same illustration to show how it works. All right, back to the PowerPoint then. Introduce one further claim. This one's a moral claim. The claim, or a moral principle, the principle of tolerance, the principle that societies and individuals ought not to interfere with or impose their values on members of other societies. All right. Before turning to this third line of argument for moral skepticism, let me first focus on the relation between these first two views, between moral skepticism and cultural relativism. Right? one thing that there's some tendency for people to think is that these two views, moral skepticism and cultural relativism, are in some way basically the same, right? I want to suggest that's wrong. I want to suggest you've got to be clear about the differences between them. Let me first do an extreme version of the differentiation, and then I'll suggest some worries about that, but hopefully it'll bring out the way in which the two views are different. Look, someone might say moral skepticism and cultural relativism, they're not the same, they're not even compatible, right? If you believe one, you've got to reject the other. Because they could say, look, moral skepticism, it says, we go to the slide here for a minute, it says there's no such thing as objective moral truth. So it tells you, you know, moral truth is something that there just isn't, right? By contrast, cultural relativism says there is such a thing as moral truth, and here's how you find it. You look at the society's moral code, right? So moral skepticism tells you there isn't any such thing, anything of this kind. Cultural relativism tells you, yeah, there is, and here's how you go about discovering it. Right? If we get to switch back. If that were right, then these views would be incompatible, right? Such that you can't properly believe both of them. Now, I'm not sure it is right, because here's a response to what I just said. Right? The response says, well, look, properly understood cultural relativism gives you moral truth, but it doesn't give you objective moral truth. Right? Instead, it gives you a kind of subjective moral truth determined by what the society thinks. I mean, I can see why someone would say that. I mean, it's not, mind you, it's not determined by what the individual thinks, it's determined by what the society thinks. But still, I see the comeback to the initial thing I said, which says, no, well, they're not incompatible because cultural relativism gives you not objective moral truth, but subjective moral truth of a kind. But look, they're certainly different, right? I mean, all the moral skeptic's committed to is denying that there's objective moral truth. The moral skeptic is certainly not committed to saying, but there is this other kind of moral truth, right? That's an additional, independent, further view. It's not in any way built into moral skepticism. So, even if moral skepticism and cultural relativism are not incompatible, they're certainly different and independent, right? Okay? All right. If we got that on board, we're then in a position to explore a third familiar line of argument for moral skepticism. And now we've made the distinction, we can also, you know, do a variant of the argument where it becomes an argument for cultural relativism. Right? Let me sort of sketch the general idea here, and then I'll, you know, give you a slide with a formulation of it. So the general idea of this third line of argument is that we should accept moral skepticism, or, you know, if we can do this other variant now, we should accept cultural relativism because it supports tolerance, right? So the person making this argument thinks tolerance is a good thing, and the reason to accept moral skepticism is that it supports tolerance. I mean, you get things that are like this argument. When people talk about how, if there's no right or, if there's no real right or wrong, then it just won't do for people to impose their values on others, and, everyone should, accept that their opinions are just opinions, and so are everyone else. Right? I mean, so I think, you will find that it's a kind of argument that's familiar. So, let me find it here. So here's how it goes, I think. So what you got here is, a sketch of the overall line of thought. And you'll see that there are sort of two variants. There's the variant where it's a line of thought or argument in favor of moral skepticism, and the variant where it's the line of argument in favor of cultural relativism. And then in each case, there's this crucial little one-premise argument on which the whole line of thought depends. All right. Switch views for a second. So look, whether either of the variants of this line of thought work depends crucially on the success of those little one-premise arguments referred to towards the end of the PowerPoint, right? Namely the arguments 1, moral skepticism, therefore 2, principle of tolerance, or the argument 1, cultural relativism, therefore 2, principle of tolerance, right? Key question then about this line of thought is, are those arguments any good? Consider then the first of them. I wonder if I can do a pointy thing on this. Yeah, go back to PowerPoint briefly. So consider, if you can see my little arrow. Yeah. Okay. So this one, right? The argument which we're formulating using our abbreviation scheme: 1, moral skepticism, therefore 2, principle of tolerance. We'll switch back. question is that a valid argument? And the answer is, when you think about it rightly, no, it's certainly not a valid argument. It's a really bad argument, actually. The way to see that is, look, not merely does moral skepticism not support the principle of tolerance. If you think it through, moral skepticism is not even really compatible with the principle of tolerance. I mean, that is, if moral skepticism is true, the principle of tolerance must be false. Because look, moral skepticism says there's no objective moral truth. That is, no moral principles are true or correct. No moral principles are any more true or correct than any other. And they're all objectively wrong. Right? How could you possibly get from the premise that there are no true moral principles to the conclusion that a certain moral principle is true? I mean, you can't, right? I mean, if the premise is right, if moral skepticism is true, there are no true moral principles, it can't possibly be that a certain moral principle, the principle of tolerance, is correct. Right? So, I mean, as it were, not merely is this an argument such that the premise does not support the conclusion, worse, right? I mean, it's an argument where if the premise is right, the conclusion has to be wrong. Right? Everyone see that? So, I mean, so that version, despite its popularity, just doesn't work at all. Right? Now, go back to PowerPoint briefly. Consider the second variant mini-argument in here, the argument cultural relativism, therefore principle of tolerance. Right. Switch back. That one is not as bad, but still definitely, when you think about it, doesn't work. It's not a valid argument. The way to see that, or one way to see that, is this. Right? Way to see whether, in and of itself, cultural relativism supports tolerance. Right? Consider first the tolerant society. The tolerant society is a society into whose moral code the principle of tolerance is built. According to cultural relativism, ought members of the tolerant society to be tolerant or intolerant? They ought to be tolerant, right? Because, I mean, cultural relativism says the moral code of your society determines what's right in your society, right? So if your society's moral code includes the principle of tolerance, tells you you ought to be tolerant, then, you know, you ought to be tolerant. Now consider the intolerant society, right? The society into whose moral code the contrary principle of intolerance is built. According to cultural relativism, ought members of the intolerant society to be tolerant or intolerant? They ought to be intolerant, right? Because, I mean, that's the principle that's built into their moral code. I mean, what that brings out to you is something that, once you see it, you see was in cultural relativism all along, right? I mean, cultural relativism just sort of ratifies whatever's in a given society's moral code. In and of itself, it gives you no reason to believe one moral principle rather than another. It's sort of in and of itself neutral. It just all depends what the society's moral code contains, right? So you can't support the principle of tolerance or any other particular moral principle simply on the basis of cultural relativism, right? So that argument fails too. Okay? All right. So if, you know, Rachel's is right and I'm right, so thus far then the moral skeptic is 0 for 3, right? I mean, there's 3 sort of familiar standard arguments for moral skepticism and none of them work. Right? So I guess I just want to do 3 more things, really, on this general topic. First, I want to make a suggestion about how best to understand, you know, many people's views on this question, perhaps yours, right? I mean, it seems to me that lots of people come into this area with in the popular sense, a sort of schizophrenic view, right? You know, in the popular sense, it's schizophrenic because it's sort of in two minds, right? So, on the one hand, if you ask the sort of explicit relativist question, you know, do you think there's any moral truth, or do you think it's all just a matter of opinion? People are quite likely to say, oh, I think it's all a matter of opinion. Right? On the other hand, if you ask, do you think that slavery is really wrong? People say, yeah, I think slavery is really wrong. I mean, do you think it's wrong to torture innocent children just for fun? Sure, I do. Right? So what's going on, right? I mean, what's going on when someone on the one hand is inclined to endorse these sort of abstract relativist ideas, and on the other hand has a number of particular moral convictions which they regard as correct? Right? I suggest one way to make sense of that sort of view is to think, what's going on is the person thinks sort of, there is some moral truth, but there's less than some other people think there is. That is, the person who has this kind of initially incoherent package of views is the person whose views are sort of best sorted out as amounting to, yeah, there really is an objective truth about whether it's right to torture innocent children just for fun, but maybe there isn't an objective truth about controversial issues like the morality of abortion. Now, of course, some other people, you know, partisans on each side of the abortion issue, think there is an objective truth about that. So the person I'm imagining sort of thinks there's less moral truth than those people think there is, because, I mean, about that matter, there is no moral truth. But this person doesn't think there's no moral truth at all, because they do think there are a bunch of issues about which there is a truth. Right? So, you know, one way to make sense of this initially sort of incoherent package that I think quite a lot of people start out with is to resolve it as, again, the view that, yeah, there is some moral truth, but there's less than a bunch of other people think there is. Second thing, I want to warn you against, I don't know if these are exactly arguments for moral skepticism, but they're at least sort of tempting patterns of thought that you want to subject to critical scrutiny and avoid, right? The two related ones. One goes something like this. Someone starts out with the idea that there is a, let's say, an objective truth about the morality of promising, and the objective truth is that you absolutely always ought to keep your promises. Then they're presented with a counterexample, right? A case where, let's say, the only way you could keep a promise is to avoid, you know, helping someone in desperate need and thereby, you know, cause their death, right? And the person's persuaded, okay, in that case you ought not to keep the promise. Right? Then, according to this line of thought, you conclude, oh, well, so there can't be any objective truth about the morality of promising. If you think about it, what's going on there is that what you're thinking is, if there were a truth about promising, it would have to be terribly simple, right? If there were a true moral principle about promising, it would have to be, you know, sort of stateable in 6 words or less. But, you know, on reflection, that seems like a silly constraint, right? I mean, we don't think if there's a truth about physics, it has to be terribly simple. We don't think if there's a truth about biology, it has to be terribly simple. So why should we think if there's a truth about morality, it has to be terribly simple? I mean, couldn't it be that there was a truth, but it was fairly complicated? So I want to, you know, recommend that you avoid thinking, you know, if morality doesn't turn out to be terribly, terribly simple, there can't be a right answer. Right? Sort of related, tempting line of thought to avoid. This is the one that goes, with respect to that promising example, well, you know, you sort of think about it, you come up with a simple principle, you think of the counterexample, then you're not exactly sure quite how to put it. Right? and you think about it for 10 minutes, you still can't figure out how to put it. And they say, oh, well, that means there can't be any correct principle here. The underlying thought there is the thought, if there's a truth about morality, it must be possible to figure it out thinking not very hard in less than 10 minutes. Right? But again, we don't think that in other cases, right? I mean, we don't think if there's a truth about biology, it must be, must be possible to figure it out in less than 10 minutes thinking not very hard, right? We don't think if there's a truth about physics, it must be possible to figure it out in less than 10 minutes thinking about it not very hard. So again, why should we think that about ethics, right? But, the truth in ethics might be complex, and it might be difficult to figure out, right? Final thing on this. I want to be clear what sort of the aim here is, right? Rachel's aim is not, and my aim is not, to demonstrate that moral skepticism is false. I certainly don't take myself to have done that, and he doesn't either, right? The aim's much more modest, right? I mean, strategically speaking, in an ethics course, the aim is roughly this. You're worried that if you don't talk about this at the beginning of the course, some subsection of your students are going throughout the course to think and periodically to express the view that, oh, well, we know it's all just a matter of opinion, right? So what you want to do is sort of take that on up front, right? You want to say, look, this idea, there's no objective moral truth, it's all just a matter of opinion, right? It's not obviously true. The person who thinks it's obviously true is the person who thinks there are these simple, clean, knockdown arguments in its favor. But what we've just seen is there aren't, right? There aren't, the most familiar, simple arguments for moral skepticism really aren't very good, right? Doesn't mean it's wrong. I mean, maybe it might turn out to be right. If you think about it, in more sophisticated ways. But you shouldn't then enter on a class of this kind, with this kind of dogmatic confidence that it's got to be true, right? Instead, you should enter on a class of this kind with an open mind, right? With the idea, maybe there's discoverable moral truth, maybe there isn't. Let's try. Let's see if we can find some, right? And, you may discover at the end of the semester that you think that you haven't, you've discovered you can't really learn anything, right? You may think that you've discovered that you can, right? But what you shouldn't do is start out with the attitude, I just know in advance that it's all just a matter of opinion. There couldn't possibly be anything to learn. Because, unless Rachel's and I have sort of failed to spot this knockdown argument for moral skepticism that's sort of right there and everyone else can see, which, I'd be interested to see if you thought that, but, I don't think that's the way it is. Unless that's the way it is, look, there isn't any simple, straightforward knockdown argument, right? So you can't sensibly go into this assuming that moral skepticism's got to be true. The sensible attitude instead is you enter the course with an open mind. Okay? All right, good. So that's that topic, and we'll turn to morality and religion next time.